Great. Thank you, Brandy, and thank you all for coming for my talk. Welcome. And thanks, Citrus, for letting me present my work here today. I'm really excited about this opportunity, and it's a great honor. So as Brandy said, I will talk today about collective intelligence, crowdsourcing, and democratic innovations. And all that will be introduced to you by using one case study from Finland, where I'm originally from, where we crowdsourced an off-road traffic law reform with the help of the Finnish government and the Committee for the Future in the Finnish Parliament. And that study is part of my series of case studies that I've conducted in the past years, where I study the phenomenon of OpenX. I've developed this concept of OpenX, which means the open there means opening up processes that used to be closed or beyond citizens' access. So the opening of them brings citizens access to these processes, whether they are policymaking, design, or journalism. And the X here means the undefined nature of the crowd, just like in this picture. When we open up these processes by crowdsourcing online, we get a self-selected group of people, and we don't really know who they are, what they do, how they behave, and if in the beginning, if they will participate at all. So the X refers to that kind of undefined nature. And also the X defines to all the unknowns that we still have in these type of processes that we open up online for anybody to participate in. We don't know what happens. We don't know the impacts of them. We don't know the benefits or the downsides. And that's what my work is about, bringing more knowledge, kind of trying to gap this lack of knowledge we have in these type of processes. And today, in this kind of sequence of OpenX that I will be presenting you, I'm going to focus on two main questions, which are: how does crowdsourcing impact lawmaking process? And then the second question being, how does crowdsourcing impact citizens' role in democracy? And I've divided the talk into 5 different scenes. And in each scene, I go to I present different parts of the study. And I make a full disclaimer right now that there is so much more that I could talk about. We have several research papers in our research team. So just after the talk, if you are interested in knowing more, just ask questions in the Q&A section, or then you can ping me later on by email. So first, let's meet one of the participants in this crowdsourced lawmaking process that we conducted in Finland. Crowdsourcing in this context means opening up a lawmaking process for anybody to participate in online. And this person, he's called Jaska, and he's a middle-aged Finn living in northern part of Finland, and he participated in the lawmaking process by using his small tablet device. And as you see, he lives just by the Arctic Circle in the northern part of Finland, where I'm from too. And for the most of the year, we have snow there, 7 months a year. We have a lot of snow. So Jaska uses snowmobile to ride around his area. He uses snowmobile to commute to bank and to post office, and also to do grocery shopping. Also, Jaska happens to have reindeer. He's one of these people in Finland who own reindeer, and he uses snowmobile for reindeer herding. Think about the northern part of Finland, just like Alaska here in the United States, so you get the picture. And off-road traffic refers to traffic that's happening beyond established roads. Basically, always when you ride your snowmobile, or when you ride an ATV in the summer, you're actually practicing off-road traffic. And we do have an existing law in Finland that governs off-road traffic. Basically, it governs the safety in off-road traffic. It tries to regulate the harm to the nature that off-road traffic creates. But the law is outdated. People like Jaska and other people also living in more southern parts of Finland who use snowmobile or ATVs in the summer, they are frustrated because they think the law should be updated. And on the other hand, then there are people who think that the law should be updated so that, because there is increased amount of off-road traffic in Finland, so the nature should be prevented in a more efficient way. So then our Ministry of the Environment, Mr. Ville Niinistö, who is here on the right, so he decided so now this law needs to be reformed. And he decided that the law needs to be reformed in a new way, and he wanted to engage the citizens in this particular lawmaking process. And that's how I and our research team comes to play because we designed the process and conducted the crowdsourcing effort here. And the way we define crowdsourcing here in the most simplistic way is that crowdsourcing is an open call online for the crowd to perform a suggested task. And the power in this type of a crowdsourcing effort, the way we define it in our research team, is that the power is shared between the participants and the crowdsourcer. So it's not like, this is not an opinion poll where you can just submit your opinion, like choose yes or no, but this is much more because you can actually submit an idea that can be considered to the law. So you have more power in the process in an ideal case. And the task here in our case was to participate in the lawmaking process by submitting an idea. And it all happened online on a dedicated crowdsourcing platform. We licensed crowdsourcing software actually here from Berkeley from a company called IdeaScale. So this all happened online on this platform where we gave people background information and materials about the off-road traffic law and the process in itself. And they were asked to submit their ideas about certain categories that we had defined, such as tell us how should we improve off-road traffic law so that the safety of off-road traffic could be improved, how could we protect the nature better, how should we regulate the age limits in off-road traffic, and so on. So we had a structured process, and we have structured instructions for the participants. And the crowdsourcing, so we were crowdsourcing these ideas in a very simple way. People could submit their idea by using this, just clicking submit your idea button on the website. And the ideas would be presented on the website like this. Everybody would see everybody else's ideas. People could vote for them. They would get a rating on the popularity list. They could also vote ideas down if they didn't like them. They could comment on each other's ideas, and so on. And what happens here then, we actually tap into the collective intelligence of the participants by using crowdsourcing as a problem-solving method in a lawmaking process. And the notion of collective intelligence, how many of you are familiar with the notion of collective intelligence? Just like 1/3 of people. Okay, so basically what it means is that it's based on the notion of that large group of people bringing more diversity, like social, socioeconomical, and cognitive diversity, and that those components will increase the problem-solving capacity of the crowd. And that actually outweighs the problem-solving capacity of an expert in an idle case. So that aggregated knowledge of people that we can tap into by using crowdsourcing brings the emergent collective intelligence about this certain matter to us, to our hands. And if we use the term of knowledge neighborhood from management science of engineering, which is familiar to you who are engineers, how many engineers are here? Few. Okay. So I hope this crowd is diverse, by the way. So all of us, we operate in our local knowledge neighborhoods inherently. Like we have built it through our education, through all the knowledge that we have processed through our lives. And so then this is a picture of the Finnish parliament. So all the Finnish parliamentaries, the members of the parliament, they operate in their own knowledge neighborhoods. And if they want to reach out to distant knowledge neighborhoods, that can be really costly and inefficient if you don't know even like where to start from. But what happens with crowdsourcing is that you actually extend the knowledge search to distant knowledge neighborhoods in a very efficient way because you use communication technologies that are cheap and easy to use. And then you can actually reach out to hundreds of thousands of millions of people. And that way you actually turn the local search to a distant search that turns back into the local search of those people who participate because they will search the solution from the knowledge neighborhood that they operate in. And this mechanism can be very efficient in terms of problem solving and knowledge search. As we learned in the open constitution reform process that happened in Iceland a couple of years back, how many of you have heard about this? About, 1/4 of the people. So what happened in Iceland was that they used crowdsourcing in one part of the constitution reform process. And what happened was that they got really interesting information through crowdsourcing. For instance, they got a tip from a researcher overseas for the constitution reform working group. He wanted to make the working group aware that when they reform the constitution, that in the human rights article, they should take the increasing popularity of consumer genome tests into account. You know, these genome tests that you can do, you can pay like $100 for 23andMe, and you spit into a bottle and send it off to the company, and they'll give you your DNA information and the probabilities of different kind of diseases that you might have and your gene mutations. I have one gene mutation, by the way. So the researcher wanted to let the Constitutional Reform Board to know that, so this is an increasing phenomena overseas, so it will also land in Iceland. So the insurance companies might start to actually discriminate people based on their DNA information. So that type of a thing should be, of course, covered in the law so that no one could be discriminated based on that information. And that tip was something that the Constitution Reform Board wouldn't have thought about otherwise. So they increased like the problem-solving capacity and the knowledge search capacity are some of the reasons why we use crowdsourcing in law reform process or in policymaking in general. But then there are other reasons too. So if we look at the larger societal landscape that's happening here in the Western world throughout, also in Scandinavia, unfortunately. So we are in the middle of democratic recession, meaning that there is declining trust in political institutions. There is decrease in voting activity. And there's decreasing social cohesion. Like the trend in Northern Europe, also in Scandinavia, there is a rise in right-wing, very extreme right-wing movements that are breaking the society into extreme parts about immigration and other issues like that. So, but at the same time, when we are in this remote recession, we have all these wonderful democratic innovations that are kind of almost there for us to use. By democratic innovation, I use the term defined by Smith, meaning democratic innovations deepen, like have the potential to deepen citizen participation in democratic processes. So basically, democratic innovations will bring citizens to the core of decision-making and political processes in general, rather than keeping them in the vast ferry of democracy. But then these democratic innovations, such as crowdsourcing in lawmaking or some other innovations that we are seeing, I'm not saying, my argument here is not to say that these will save us somehow, or this will save the democracy in general, or the democratic innovations will somehow even alleviate the democratic recession that we have. So they are not like stairway to heaven, basically. But they do give us some possibilities to explore new opportunities to include citizens in processes that were previously beyond their access. And we would be stupid as humankind if we didn't explore these possibilities and try these innovations out and try to develop them further. And that's my mission. I think that's why I'm here as a part of this humankind. And that's also the mission of my research team, which is here. Apart from me, I'm working with Ellen Landemore, who is an assistant professor of political science at Yale University. She specializes in democratic theory. Then we have Ashish Goel, professor of management science and engineering and computer science at Stanford University. And then his PhD student, David Lee, also at Stanford. And so this is the work that I'm presenting today is part of our teamwork. So then let's proceed to the next scene here. So let's look more closely, how did the crowdsourced off-road traffic law reform process look like and what happened there? So first, this is necessary, especially for you who are not Europeans here today. So to understand how a lawmaking process works in the Finnish parliamentary system. So what happens here is that typically the lawmaking process, it will be initiated by the parliament or the government who decide that now we need to reform a law or we need to write a new law. And then there are civil servants in the government who are experts in that topic area. So they'll take over the law reform process. They actually draft the bill. And they work with interest groups, lobbying groups, and they set up an expert committee, like a working group for the law reform, if they so decide, or then they consult experts however they like to. And they work very independently. And then after the bill is ready and it's accepted by the government, it's presented for the parliament. And the parliament has the decision-making power over the bill. Like, it will accept it, or it will reject it, or it will ask for revisions. And then, so what happens when we introduce crowdsourcing to this process? We see the crowd there in the blue button. So the crowd becomes part of this preparatory process. So when we frame the crowdsourcing as problem solving and knowledge search, so the crowd brings in hopefully somewhat useful information for in the lawmaking process, in the preparatory process. But the parliament still has the decision-making power. So we are not talking about a decision-making method here, but we're talking about knowledge search process for the preparatory process in the lawmaking. This is really important to understand this difference here. Not a decision-making process, but like process to get more information for the law reform. And how we designed this process then was that we had two separate crowdsourcing stages. In the first phase, we asked people to share the problems they have with the current law and off-road traffic in general. We got really active participation. In the Finnish scale, we are only 5 million people altogether, hundreds of submissions. We analyzed all the input that the citizens left on the platform, and then we asked them to solve the problems that they have presented in the first phase. So we moved from this kind of whining and not so maybe constructive mode to the constructive and brainstorming and more positive problem-solving mode, trying to inject some design thinking to the process and ideation and refining the ideas further. And we got hundreds of submissions again. And then we designed an evaluation phase where we used two ways to evaluate the ideas. I will present those a little bit later. And then right now we are in the fourth phase where all the material is in the government, in the Ministry of Environment, and they are evaluating the crowdsourced information, and they are figuring out how it could be actually channeled to the law. And so the timeline is so that in a good case scenario, there would be a bill that will go to the parliament sometime early next fall. So, and what's interesting here in all these hundreds of ideas that we got, so the nature of the ideas was mostly very constructive, and so was the conversation online. Like, we got over 4,000 comments, of which we had to just remove 20 because they were inappropriate, so very low percentage needed to be moderated away. And the issues that we reflected in the ideas that the participants submitted were the issues that generally relate to this law. Basically, how about landowners' rights? Like, how much power should a landowner have over, like, if they should have the power to be able to reject snowmobile riders from their lands, or should they be, if there's a need for a snowmobile route, should the landowners just need to give their land for that use, and how much should they be compensated for this type of use of their land? And then another big issue is the indigenous people's rights. We happen to have the only indigenous people in Europe that's recognized by the European Union, the Sami people who live in the northern part of Finland. And they live on reindeer herding, they live on hunting and gathering, so they move around in the nature a lot. So should they have different types of rights for snowmobile riding, for instance? And how about then the snowmobile owners' rights? People who have invested a lot to devices that they could move around in the nature, but all of a sudden then they realize, oh, I can't ride anywhere I want to. And then the nature's values, who's going to protect the nature if there is an increased amount of off-road traffic and people want to ride everywhere. And then just the basic right of our right to a peaceful environment in general. Like, if you have a summer cabin, for instance, somewhere, or winter cabin, you might not want to have a snowmobile route going just a few 100 feet away from your cabin. So now I'm going to move to some of the findings that we have come up so far. And this part is based on our user interviews. We have interviewed participants, and we have done several surveys to the online participants. So first of all, what was interesting to us that crowdsourcing, it creates spaces for learning online. So the participants, they didn't learn only from the materials that we posted online about off-road traffic law, but they learned a lot from each other. For instance, here, to cite one example, a participant asks about a concept in the law. Like, he has read all the materials, but he's still confused. He doesn't know what a certain term means. So then there are a bunch of other people who respond to him, also me as a moderator. And he gets a lot of responses. And at the end, he says, at the end of this conversation thread, we don't see it here, he says, oh, thanks a lot for the clarification. Now I understand what this term is about. Also, what we learned was interesting for us was about deliberation. That deliberation, it actually happens without incentives. Because our process, it wasn't designed to support deliberation, meaning reasoned exchange of individuals, exchange of arguments of individuals, but we had designed the process for knowledge search. But people exchange arguments in a very deliberative way, even though there were no incentives for that. And also what was interesting is that there was an organic inclination towards consensus, meaning we didn't incentivize consensus at all. But especially towards the end of the process, people started to present ideas that took many different angles or many different stakeholders. You remember those balloons of issues that I showed you earlier? So they started to present ideas that include many of those issues and angles, and not just, they didn't present just ideas that kind of favor their own group. So what is interesting to us to notice is that what happens there in these crowdsourcing processes is cross-cutting exposure, that when people have to actually see each other's ideas from different stakeholder groups, and it's all online for anybody to see and participate, that actually impacts people's behavior. Even though the opinion change might be small, the measured opinion change that we had, it was self-reported though, but we didn't detect a lot of opinion changes. But what we saw here is a distributed form of deliberation, meaning that the deliberation that happened in these two different crowdsourcing phases that we had, it happens in several sequences and several stages. It's not like one continuous process, but it's actually asynchronous. And also it's continuing still because now the authorities are considering people's input to the law, and there will be public debate and public coverage about the issue. Also, what's really significant for this type of crowdsourcing processes is this finding about the crowd not being delusional, meaning there's oftentimes you hear like counter arguments for using crowdsourcing or any type of citizen engagement in democratic processes, saying that, well, that will create like a delusion or illusion for the participants that they can take over the law or they can write the law or only their opinion will be heard. But our crowd didn't think so. They were really realistic or even skeptical about their potential impact on the law. Like, they knew that one idea won't change the law, and none of the ideas will probably end up to the law as they are. Like, the end result, the law will be a compromise of many different angles and issues and debates and negotiations. And also, they thought that it's really possible, even though they were so active and participated in the process, they still thought that it's possible that their participation won't be taken into account at the end at all. Because that's how the nature of politics, that there are a lot of trade-offs and so on. And also what we found that there is a lot of distrust in political institutions in general among the participants, that they don't trust the traditional lawmaking process, partially because there is not so much transparency. They don't know who are the experts that are being heard in a lawmaking process, and they don't know who actually has the power in a lawmaking process. And then we're going to talk about the idea assessment process, which I mentioned earlier. Because one of the big challenges that we have in this type of crowdsourced processes is how do you actually process the ideas? How do you evaluate them? Like, we got hundreds of ideas. How could we actually create more information about the ideas and not just hand them over to the government and say, here are the ideas, where there might be inclination in some parts of the government to say, oh, these were not valuable at all, and we have known all this, since last decade. So we want to open up the idea assessment process too, so that all the ideas would be evaluated and we could give feedback to the participants so that they would be motivated to participate in future processes too. So we created two ways. We created an international expert panel, and then we actually built a new tool. It's called CrowdConsensus. It's a crowd evaluation tool. So the international expert panel is distributed over to several countries, and they have several fields of expertise. And they would evaluate the ideas using 4 different criteria: effectiveness, ease of implementation, cost efficiency, and fairness. And they would get an online survey that would have, based on their expertise area, they would get certain ideas that they would evaluate. For instance, here the idea is RFID stickers should be added to all vehicles, meaning so that it would be easier to track illegal riding. And then the expert panel member would use the Likert scale to evaluate the ideas and give also a free-form feedback. And then the crowd evaluation tool, what we did was that we created 3 different ways for the participants to evaluate the ideas. And the participants here mean not only participants who participated also in the idea creation mode earlier in the process, but also new participants. This was open online for anybody to participate in again. And so these three different methods were scoring. So here we have an idea about establishing new routes. If a route permit has been granted, but the feasibility of the route plan is not inspected on a yearly basis, the route permit should be automatically annulled. And then there is more information behind the link. And then the participant is asked to score the idea by giving the stars. The second type of evaluation was ranking, so that you would get, if you were a participant, you would get a certain amount of ideas from each category, and you would drag them to your preferred order. And then the last one was to compare 2 different ideas from the same category. And each of the participants who sign up for this part of the process, they would get a random sample of ideas across the categories, and they would all complete about 100 actions. And what we found out was really interesting because, as I said, this is one of the major challenges, like how do you actually how do you get people to evaluate the ideas, and what are the different methods? So this was a crucial experiment for us. And what we found out was that the crowd was really smart here in the sense that they were very consistent in their rankings. And then what happened was that the most commonsensical ideas raised to the top, and at the bottom we had the most extreme or outlandish ideas, kind of ideas that are unjust or just take one angle into account. And what was interesting for us in the evaluation results too was that we found a Condorcet winner in almost all the categories. For you who do social choice theory, you know how difficult it might be to find Condorcet winners, and there's a lot of back and forth whether it's even possible, but in our case we got it almost throughout the categories. So we are formulating a hypothesis here that maybe Condorcet winners are easier to find in real world experiments than they are maybe in other types of experiments. And in terms of the evaluation results, what was interesting and important for us that we were able to detect 2 main clusters here, a maturity cluster and minority cluster, based on their idea preferences. So we first detected the clusters, and then we laid over demographic data. And what we found out that in the maturity cluster, these were people who are actually snowmobile riders and owners, whereas in the minority cluster, these are landowners, females, and also people who care more about the values of the nature, which is important in the sense that we didn't want to just provide like a ranking list of ideas, because that's not that valuable, because it's a self-selected group of people. It's not the public opinion. It's not a random sample. It's not a representative sample. But if we can detect this type of clusters within the data, we can actually show that these are the parties or stakeholders or preferences that are present here. So this can be informing to the authorities. So then to the final scene where we will pull all this together, and I'm going to address the question of what does crowdsourcing do for policymaking and citizens' role, those being the questions that I presented in the beginning. So let's go first back to Jaska, our main hero here. So how was the experience for him? He was the one of the participants that we interviewed for our study. So him and his mates, so the other participants that we interviewed, so for some of them, this was the first time that they actually participate in a public policymaking process between elections. So they're just used to vote because that's the main way for us as citizens to try to have an impact. So they felt this can be useful for them and it's appealing way for them to try to have an impact because it's easy for them to access the process online, even though, like Jaska, he lives in a really remote area, so it's hard for him even to go to any meetings or anything because he lives so far away from any town centers. And he felt like it's great to get to have a say in a process that impacts an issue that's like an everyday issue for him. So he's not just voting for a party or for a candidate in elections, but he's actually trying to resolve a problem that he has with snowmobile riding. And Jaska and the other participants that we interviewed, they felt empowered about this new possibility. So, and then let's talk about how does this type of crowdsourced process impact on traditional lawmaking. So, as we demonstrated here, we can see that in an ideal case, there is extended problem-solving capacity that's pretty easy to tap into, and the nature of the input you get, it can be good and constructive. And then, of course, we need to talk about the representatives of the crowd, which I already said that we're not talking about the mini-publics approach here. For you who are familiar with deliberative democratic theory, we are not talking about like public opinion or public opinion poll, but we are talking about a knowledge search process. So the unrepresentativeness or the representatives, it doesn't really make a difference in terms of legitimacy of the process. But the only thing here, what's important is to, of course, to get as many participants as possible from as diverse groups as possible to increase the possibility to find good solutions. But so what's the most kind of impactful thing so far in terms of this type of crowdsourced policymaking processes going forward is the potential to create reasoned deliberation between authorities and citizens, not only citizens among themselves, but to create that bridge from authorities to citizens, because the situation is actually this. We have the citizens' knowledge here. We have civil servants who are used to have the power over the law-making process, and they are used to define what type of authorities and experts they consult while they are drafting the law, and they are not used to the transparency of the process at all. Then we have the political power, the actual decision makers in the parliament and in the government who will decide what type of law will be accepted. So the big challenge that we have here is to actually create this kind of blended expertise and meld all this together and to create trust between these, across the crack that we have here in the trust. And that's something that we are working on, and I don't know if we can tackle it in this process, hopefully, because the crack seems to be so wide. But what's on our side here is the transparency of the process. How many of you know this guy? Okay, 2 people. So it's the anxiety cat who knows everything about the internet. And she knows also what has been seen cannot be unseen. And what it means in this context is that the increased transparency of the process, meaning now all the input from the citizens, it's online for anybody to see. It has raised a public debate in Finland. It has been covered in the press that the law is being reformed, and these are the different opinions and stakeholders who are part of this.
So it's not like the process is not just silent somewhere far away in the government, but it's actually with the people. And that's where crowdsourcing for policymaking turns into an accountability technology, meaning it empowers citizens because they are part of the process. They know so much more. They have learned from their peers, and they have learned in the process what this law is about. And they feel empowered so that they actually contact the policymakers and authorities now, and they ask about the law, like what's going on. And if they don't get responses that they are happy with, they will ask why my idea is not considered to the law, but this other idea is. So this comes back to the point that the accountability technology, what it makes the authorities accountable to the participants, to the citizens. So this type of a lawmaking process that was previously beyond the citizens' access, all of a sudden they can actually have contact with the lawmakers and the authorities and deliberate with them too, like how can you reason these type of choices in the law that we were part of the process. So with this closing argument, I wanna close this talk, and I wanna thank a lot of people who have been part of this process, advising and mentoring and participating. And on top of, like, the most important thing is, of course, to thank the Finnish people, hundreds of them, thousands of them who participated in the process and who are still part of the process. So thank you. And if you have questions, we will have about 10 minutes for questions starting soon. And you can also email me or ping me. I'm here on campus at least 3 days a week if you want to meet here. And then the final thing, like, if you want to be part of a democratic innovation right now, go to californiareportcard.org and take there are instructions there how to participate in the California Report Card version 1 that we launched some 2-3 weeks ago. Just click on the begin button, you will be part of a democratic innovation. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Simon. I'm a Berkeley student, mechanical engineering student. First, thank you for the wonderful results your team got out of this research process. And then I think it's a great perspective in terms of creating accountability, also transparency between the government and our citizens. My question is that, so I assume that the online participants are anonymous, right? They don't show their real identity. So I guess, like, it's great to have, like, good organic consensus, but sometimes I feel like anonymous group discussion may create peer pressure for, like, people to actually express their own opinions. So also sometimes, like, some people talk about an opinion and then it's like some other people see it and then they may have their own original ideas, but they may just follow suit, So that's just one concern I have. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon, for your feedback. I've also studied mechanical engineering, so Mechie. So that's a good question. So in our case, the participants, they could choose whether they are anonymous or not anonymous, and most of the people wanted to be anonymous. And in the user interviews, participant interviews, it turned out that they actually feel more free to express their opinions when they are anonymous, because some of these participants were actually lawyers, from different realms, different stakeholder groups. Some of them were working in municipalities related to off-road traffic issues, so they didn't feel comfortable participating, like, with their real name, because they felt like then they would have been bound by their professional role. So we didn't see any, like, delusion wasn't a problem, like, in terms of, like, the organic consensus, but it also came out in the participant interviews that people who started to think that way, that, well, if I present something that looks like a compromise, that will be more likely considered to the law, because the law will be a compromise, which is really realistic thinking, I think.
Hi. I co-founded a company called Peak Democracy, and we try to do this kind of online civic engagement in ways that we think increase public trust in government. So I think you did a nice presentation here. I enjoyed it. And I'm just curious, I have two related questions. One is, What was the effect of that you allowed the participants to vote on other people's ideas? And did that create the expectation that the idea with the most votes should be implemented? Because we kind of wonder whether you're tapping into a collective intelligence or you're tapping into the activists that are just the best organized and get more people to vote up their ideas. And then my second related question is, so in the end you talked about this accountability and that maybe some of the participants had some dissonance because they wondered why their ideas weren't implemented, perhaps the ones that were voted up very highly. So we call that broken brainstorming when you give when that happens. So I was curious if you could comment on those two dynamics. Thanks.
So the first question, what is the expectation that you create when you actually use this type of crowd evaluation tool where people rate each other's ideas, basically? So first of all, just to clarify, that was a separate stage in the process. So first we had the crowdsourcing process where we crowdsourced the ideas, and those ideas are the ideas are still equal. Whatever the evaluation results say, our research group recommends the government to take all the ideas into account and use their whatever internal evaluation system they want to use to evaluate the ideas. So in terms of the crowd evaluation, so people couldn't vote, so because it's a random sample that you get, so you can't vote for your own idea, and you can't get anybody else to vote for your own idea unless, in the random sample you happen to have it, you get it. So you can't dictate who votes for which idea. So randomizing is super important. And also the crowd evaluation we used, it wasn't transparent so that you could see what how I had rated. So only we would get the data. Because of course, if you would see the results in advance, that would impact your behavior. So to control that out, we had to do it that way. But the biggest challenge here is what your question is great about, and it shows that you are familiar with this type of processes, is that the expectation that you create. Because always when you have a ranking of some sort, people start to think, oh, those were the winning ideas. And of course the winning ideas are the ones, in our case, because the demographic of the participants was skewed towards snowmobile riders. So of course those ideas who were the winning ideas, the Condorcet winners, they were pro-snowmobile riding, not pro-nature or pro-landowners. But as I said, that's where it comes. It's really important to have the clustering findings that we had so that we could say that, okay, so this cluster prefers these ideas and this cluster prefers these ideas. So you don't have just a massive ranking because that's deceiving. And then the second question was about broken brainstorming.
Accountability issue and people being upset that their ideas weren't implemented fast as the ones with the most votes.
So we haven't faced that yet because none of the ideas are implemented yet because the government is still evaluating them and it's in the process. But based on the results that we have so far, because in the user interviews, the participants say that they are realistic about their possibility or maybe even skeptical about their possibility to have an impact. So they don't expect that their idea will be taken to the law as is. But they want to get the reasons. They want to know why or why not. And that's the accountability mechanism that I was explaining about, to have that connection and at least for the participants so that they get fair and good and sincere reasoning why policy decisions are how they are. Because we as citizens, we rarely get that information. And hopefully that creates pressure to the authorities to actually make reasoned decisions.
Hi, Tanja. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Very interesting, these innovations. It forced me to think about the function of opacity in democratic governance. Opacity, the product, the condition of something being opaque, which is apparently, through transparency and accountability, something that there's been a normative judgment made by your team that absolutely there's an excess of opacity and we need to correct it. That seems to be the judgment motivating the entire effort. So let me give you an example. Someone who is worried when they participate that the amount of snowmobile noise will go up and will reduce their quality of life. Let us then imagine that in the reasoned conclusion of the government, that in fact happens to that person. This will not be crowdsourced suffering. This will be individual suffering. Consider the contention that more transparency for that person will in fact reduce their trust in government. Your comment?
Yeah, so first of all, so our premise, the motivation of this study or this experiment is not like a notion that there is too little transparency in lawmaking in general, but the motivation is to find out how we could use crowdsourcing in a meaningful way in a policymaking process, and then design a process that can be replicated and refined further. So the finding of that the users, the participants feel that there is not enough transparency. That's their perception. Okay. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing was that it was about like that for the one participant, if...
For all the users.
Like all the ones whose ideas are not considered to the law?
All the people whose lives are going to be made measurably worse by the resulting reform.
Well, I guess, so then we could compare about like the previous law and the current, like the reformed law, like what kind of implications they have and what type of implications they have on certain stakeholders' preferences. Because now it's not like, law is not just like in product design, we want to talk about the end result, the end product, and it's perfect and it's there. But lawmaking, it's a process. So what will be reformed in this new reformed law is something incremental. Because it seems to be not possible to have any radical changes in laws because the power, established power, doesn't radically change. So how would the laws change? Because it's the power struggle at the end anyway, like the political power. So I don't see that being a problem, that all of a sudden there would be a drastic change in the impact of the law. But what I'm optimistic about that hopefully some of the problems that the existing law has can be more efficiently solved now that there's more information in the lawmaker's hand. But also I want to make clear that my argument and my team's argument either is not that all the processes should be like that, and crowdsourcing should be used all the time and in every single policymaking process. But what we have figured out that it could work, there are certain conditions where it could work best and when it could be used the best. And it should be designed in the most efficient way possible. And there's also need for opacity in the process because the political negotiations will be done like that, and the trades off, and you'll get this and I'll get this into the law. And if there's kind of too much transparency in that process, I think, unfortunately, our political system wouldn't work.
Okay, one last question here.
My question is actually a technical one about access. That it may be that availability of being plugged in like that could work differently than it does here. We have something called the digital divide, where it sort of tracks with socioeconomic issues. A lot of people who are stakeholders are actually much less able to really plug in and get their perspectives included. And so it's a matter of whether it's available or they can even afford it, or sometimes a number of people don't have it at all, or they have it at a different degree. So maybe this works better in places where there is some kind of universal free lifeline service, or if a number of people who we need to hear from have it at kind of a lower speed or issue. Do we have to design whatever we put out so that it can actually be loaded and processed by them in a timely manner so they don't just get fed up and check out?
Yeah, that's a good question about digital divide. So digital divide is obvious in Finland too, even though we have a really good broadband penetration in Finland. And we would have thought that, for instance, senior people would be mostly absent from our process because we thought they are not tech savvy. It turns out that's not the case at all. Like, they are presented just like the other groups. So that was one assumption that we thought, which turned out not to be true. But the digital divide, so that's like
let's think about like when the time that we moved from horse carriages to cars. So there was a number of people who were still using horses, and then there were other group of people who were using cars. So we didn't stop building services for car users just because not everybody had cars yet. So the same thing here, like if we want to be at the forefront of innovation, we have to design for people who have the access. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't design also like like for instance, access from low-end mobile phones and all that, but also with the limited resources and limited time that you have, that if you ever want to make anything happen, you have to focus. And we focus on the group that have online access and have certain capacities. But the better and the broader in terms of access, the better.